Everybody, this is John for Nexus MTG, continuing our Burn Month series. This time we're covering certain sideboard cards. As a friendly reminder, if you like what you're seeing on the channel, please consider subscribing, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below. For maybe mentioning any particular shatter or disenchant-esque effects available to burn that I have forgotten or maybe left out. So with that, let's get into the video. So the primary choices for Burn's sideboard to answer things like Chalice of the Void, and to a lesser extent Leyline of Sanctity, are things like Destructive Revelry, Cindervines, Smash to Smithereens. These are the three that probably see the most straight up play. Obviously Smash is not capable of dealing with enchantments, but Cindervines and Destructive Revelry are. And as for the breakdown as to why the advantages and disadvantages of each, and what they're trying to do. So Smash to Smithereens doesn't require a green splash, so it's easier on the mana if you want to play Boros or Rakdos. You don't have to go into the third color to get access to it, but it does have no enchantment applications, so you're just limited to artifacts, which obviously artifacts are pretty relevant. Decks like Hardened Scales, Tron, any of the Chalice decks that are floating around and getting popularity, as Is It Phoenix has been rising to the top. Those are cards or decks you're definitely going to want to bring in Smash to Smithereens against, so there's a lot of targets. And one of the big advantages is it does 3 damage, whereas most of these other cards do 2 damage or no damage whatsoever. And it's also generally the most widespread Chalice hate card in the sideboard for Burn. So this is the card the most lists are playing, so if you're playing against Burn, this is the card you probably have to be most likely to be aware of. So obviously Chalice on 1, Chalice on 2 kind of locks this out and locks your Burn opponent out from playing. But this is a card to be aware of, and depending on what you need to set your Chalice on, like against the Boros lists are a little bit more spread out, so it's a little bit harder to Chalice lock them. Whereas the Rakdos or nearly mono red builds, generally speaking, most of their spells are centered around 1, so if you Chalice them on 1, they're kind of locked out, but you need a backup Chalice on 2 to kind of lock out their anti-hate cards. This is kind of the default setting for most decks. You'll see like this in the general Boros sideboard packages. Most people are not bringing in hate against things like Leyline of Sanctity, so this is a card to be aware of. The next card on the list is Destructive Revelry. This is kind of the in-between ground on Smash to Smithereens and Cindervines, so this one requires a green splash, so it does stretch your mana base a little bit, as the Boros lists or as the Rakdos lists can deal with enchantments, so this gives you an out to Destructive Revelry. Its primary advantages over something like Cindervines is its instant speed, so it's not on board. And it does less damage than Smash to Smithereens, but it's more flexible, obviously being able to hit enchantments. The primary cost in this is stretching your mana base to that third color, which gives you some weaknesses to the color screw strategy that some decks try to employ, particularly the blue-white X decks and the black-green rock decks. So something to consider whenever you're bringing this in against various particular decks. Like say you're bringing it in against Control to hit like Search for Azcantas and Detention Spheres and such. Just be aware that you may only get a 1 or 2 shots out of your green source before it gets Ghost Quartered or Field of Ruined. Generally speaking, you wouldn't be bringing this in against Black-Green Rock, but it is something to keep in mind that you are stretching your mana base to that third color. You're making your other aggressive matchups a little bit weaker, so there isn't a trade-off cost to playing Destructive Revelry over something like Smash to Smithereens. But if you're playing against a card like Leyline of Sanctity in your meta, you definitely want an out, so definitely a reasonable choice. Third one that's kind of been gaining steam since it's printing recently with Cindervines. Once again, still stretches the mana base, can deal with enchantments. It differs from Destructive Revelry and Smash in that it has to be on board in order to take advantage of it, or you're using 3 mana in 1 turn, neither of which is particularly exciting. So it's an on-board trick primarily, but it does have a slightly expanded role, as it kind of dings your opponent for non-creature spells. So you could bring it in against Mono Red Phoenix, you can bring it in the Burn Mirror, you could bring it in against decks like Is It Phoenix or Control decks. This is a much more wide-ranging card, something that has much more utility as a sideboard slot than just a disenchant-esque effect that happens to also ding your opponent a little bit. Once again, you're stretching your mana base, but against, if you're playing against, the Leyline Prison decks, if you're playing against Is It Phoenix, if you're playing against Control in this meta, that's yet another tool that you have against them that they have to answer. So, wear tear is kind of the uh, necessary evil, I would say, option. This is for those that don't like to stretch their mana base, but still want outs to things like chalice and leyline. So this one's obviously easier on the mana, doesn't require a green splash, can deal with enchantments. It's extremely flexible. You can, kill an enchantment for one white, continue moving on. Like say you go like Swift Spear into another Swift Spear, Wear Tear, or Tear. You can get some prowess triggers. You can kind of work this into your rotation. You can go one drop into Wear your opponent's chalice, continue on your game plan. So it's very flexible in terms of its mana cost. You're not really stretching your mana base at all, at least out of Boros, which is primarily the one you'd play this. And say if your opponent has a Blood Moon and a Chalice and you can float the mana, you can easily get a 2-for-1 off this card because you can fuse it. So, this card offers flexibility, but at the cost of no damage from the card itself, and also, it's potentially a 2-for-1, which is something that's very rare in Burn, but there's only very specific decks that play that combination of cards. The final Shatter-esque effect is primarily something you're going to see out of the Rakdos decks. So this is a reason to play the Rakdos colors besides Bump in the Night. It's probably the least played of the Shatter effects, so the one that people might be the least prepared for. It's also the most flexible of them. I think the only card that measures up in terms of flexibility as to its modes is Cindervines. This one can exile graveyard, so it can come in against things like Dredge, things like Is It Phoenix if you really feel like you need to exile their Phoenixes and such, or show off their Pyromancer's Ascensions. Also, if you have people that are stuck in the 2014s and playing things like Deceiver XR Kiki Jiki, or the pod deck that's running around. This is a card that can punish them when they go for the infinite damage combo. Each creature deals 1 damage to their controller, so you can easily dome your twin-esque opponent. People trying to Kiki Jiki you or all that can kill them, but that's obviously the least used mode. But definitely, flexibility of being a Shatter against Chalice decks, pretty good against the various artifact decks, and then also as a graveyard hate piece against Dredge, gives it a lot of flexibility, so I figured I'd mention it. When I went to do the original video, this was a card that I'd forgotten about, and it's like, well, I probably better include Rakdos Charm. So Rakdos Charm is definitely a card you're going to see more out of the mono red splash bump in the night builds. So it's definitely a reason to be in black, but I would still say overall that Boros is the more solid choice. So you're more likely to be debating between things like Wear Tear Smash and the two Destructive Revelry and Cindervines. But as far as the overall which cards you should play if you want a Disenchant-esque effect in your sideboard or a Shatter effect, comes down to preference of mana base versus flexibility. The green splash gives you access to more powerful cards. I would say Destructive Revelry and Cindervines, particularly Cindervines, is more effective at what you're trying to use them for. However, Wear Tear means you don't have to stretch your mana base to that third color. You're a little less vulnerable to getting land hated, and you're a little less vulnerable to be getting, taking extra damage in the aggressive matchups. So a lot of it depends on your meta. If you're seeing a lot of Is It Phoenixes, control decks, and also artifact-based things or prison decks, the Cindervines is certainly a good worthy splash. If you're playing against a lot of humans decks, a lot of humans, a lot of merfolk, a lot of affinity, those kind of decks, it really comes down to what's your preference. Do you prefer damage, or do you just prefer your mana base not dealing you damage? Anyways, this has been John for MTG Nexus doing a breakdown of the various Shatter and Disenchant effects available to burn. We'll cover other aspects of sideboarding and spells moving forward, but this is something that I've been asked many questions on, particularly Wear Tear versus, say, Destructive Revelry and to a lesser extent Cindervines. So this was a breakdown of the various cards that are available. And as always, if you like what you're seeing, please consider subscribing, giving us a thumbs up down below.